Hello and welcome back to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day no matter what it is you're doing today. For the wirework tutorial today on YouTube, what I'd like to do is share with you a variation on quite an old design of mine. These range from about 6 or 7 years ago, and it's the first time I'd used square wire. Now, for a long time I was afraid of using profiled wire, square and the half round and the such, because it doesn't work the same as round wire. So I've got a really beautiful, great looking project for you that's super easy to achieve. If you'd like to join me down at the board, we'll take a slightly closer look at what we're going to make today. So this is the variation that we're going to learn today. The main outer frame is square wire, the secondary inner frame is square wire, and then the rest is round wire up at the top. I'm going to show you a variation. The wires that are in my ears have been crafted with a half round wire to wrap. It's a slightly different variation, as you can see. And these are wrapped with a round wire, so half round and round. I'm going to show you what the project looks like with those two different wires and how different the actual process might be. So we're actually using quite small amounts of square wire, and I will go through in detail the gauges that you'll need to complete this project and this look. And at the end of the tutorial I'll show you a little bit more closely what it looks like with a round faceted drop bead, as well as the pear side drilled bead that we're working with today. So as we go through, I'll tell you all of the project ingredients, if you like, that we're going to work with today. So this is the shape that we're going to work on. It's really attractive. It has elements, it almost looks a little bit like a fleur-de-lis, but not the same. You can use really any drop shape that you like. The ones that I have in my ear are a rounded shape briolette drop, which is faceted, and these are unfaceted pear drops that are side drilled. The key is that the drill hole goes through quite close to the tip of the drop shape. They can be quite chubby drops or they can be quite elongated drops, as long as you can reflect it with that beautiful diamond shape. So I'm going to pop these up into the corner so that we can just have those to refer to. For the first part of the tutorial, we're going to make the outside frame. Now this is a 1.25mm square wire, which is approximately equivalent to 16 gauge. It's not quite the same, but it's near enough. And it's a square wire. I'm working with raw copper because I love working with raw copper. We've got two lengths and they're about 5 inches each. So the first thing that we need to do is get a nice sharp shape down at the bottom. You can, if you need to, just straighten that up to begin with. They come on round spools usually anyway, which is a little bit different than working with the round wire. So I'm going to pop just a little bit of warmth and heat into those and just get that nice and smooth and straight. Now if you wish to, you can use a ruler to find the exact centre point. The key is that we're always going to be working with the same flat surface facing up to us. So I'm going to start by putting a really sharp, firm V shape into the wire. That's not exactly dead centre, but we've got a little bit of space up at the top to work with. So if you're going to use 5 inches, you're going to be absolutely fine. Now what you will find is that the square wire, obviously because we haven't cut a notch, this is a beginner-friendly project. If you want to get into working with square wire a little bit more, what you can do is cut a tiny notch with a saw into the upper edge of your square wire, and then when you force this bend it closes up more neatly. But we're working at a complete beginner's level today, so that's a future you project. If I pop my pliers underneath, what I'm going to do is just open that out slightly. Now we're not going to open and close it as much as we would with round wire. It doesn't have that kind of recovery. And I'm just going to bring that back slightly so that we get a nice flat shape. It's not 90 degrees, it's slightly less than that. And what we're going to do is make sure that both of those sides are nice and straight. And then I'm going to come over the top and underneath with those flat facing pliers and squash that so that any tiny elevations and wrinkles caused by the fact that there's more material now bunched into a smaller space, the outer edge is slightly stretched. That's what we do when we're working with profiled wire. So I will then need to replicate that exactly the same on the other side. And again, I would say if you wanted to, you absolutely can use a ruler to measure that, but I'm just going to go by eye and estimate where that will be. Now, because I'm working with 1.25mm, approximate about to 16 gauge, it is a little bit tougher. So you need to not be afraid to get in there, get that closed up a little bit more than you need, and then open it back. And again, I'm just going to straighten those up and flatten down any wrinkles caused by the bunching up of excess material on the inside of that bend. Now, we'd like those to be exactly the same in terms of their angle. So all that's happened on this one is that the wire isn't completely flat on that side. So I'm just going to close that up just a tiny bit more so that they sit pretty much the same. So if I just bend that top bit in, they should nestle quite nicely to begin with. So the next thing that we're going to need to do is put some coils on either top end, and the coils need to come outwards. So for this, we would use our round nose pliers. And what you need to do when you grab hold of the wire, we're going to make sure that we're grabbing hold of the outer edge. Those are not my round nose pliers, those are some chain nose pliers. So what I'm going to do is hold the V shape sideways to ensure that the levels that I'm grabbing, the surfaces rather, are the outside and the inside, not the top side and the bottom side. So if I draw that outwards very, very slowly, small movements to create the beginning of a coil, I'm going to draw that around like so. And its small movements will win in the end. So I'm not going to complete my coil because I don't know how far down I want to bring that once I have set the inner wire, once I've set that inner square wire. So I'm just going to bring that a little ways down. You might need to close that up if that's not completely closed up for you. And because you're working with square wire, you can attack it in a slightly different way if you need to. This is quite a heavy wire to work with. So I'm just going to bring those coils outwards for the time being. I'm going to flip that over and do exactly the same on the other side. So again, we're just going to turn it onto its side so that we're manipulating the square that is outside and inside, not the one that is underneath and over the top. So small movements when you're creating coils are really good, especially when you're working with a profiled wire. So I'm going to get that starting to move around in a circular form. Withdraw those round nose pliers, and then you have the opportunity to just bring those two side by side for the time being, just to kind of get a replica of each side. Now, one thing I would say, when I'm designing earrings to sell, I will always do process by process. So I've created a V, created a V. I've created coils, so the next thing I will do is create coils on the second V section. So I'm just going to take a moment with the second segment of square wire to get it to look exactly the same as the first. It just takes a moment to line those two up, but obviously you've seen the process and I don't want to bore you. So I've got them looking vaguely similar. They're pretty much the same kind of size of coils and the angle is very, very similar. So the next thing that we will need to do is bring in our second section of the square wire. Now I have two lengths here, 1, 2, and they're about 3.5 inches in length, and it's a 0.8mm square, which is 20 gauge square. Now I'm using some nice puffy pear drop shapes which have been side drilled, and they've got a really nice aspect. It's about 1/4 of the way down that drill hole goes through. Now if you're using puffy drops like this, they need to be side drilled, not front to back drilled. If you're using briolettes, which are the rounded kind of drop, then it doesn't really matter which way they sit. So I've got my two lengths with the drill holes used and the beads have been centralised. That one just needs a little bit more movement. So you will need to check the drill holes on your beads. I had a bag of these and not all of them went onto that 0.8 or 20 gauge square wire. So I'm just going to move those two outer segments up to the top. And what we need to do now, being respectful of the beads, now obviously if you're working with glass or crystal beads, you need to be super cautious with the next bend of the wire, and certainly gemstones like this, which this is a reconstituted turquoise, you do need to be aware not to put too much pressure on the drill hole with the wire. I'm going to make the wire do the work. So I'm going to turn that back on itself and line it up with the curvature of the top of that puffy drop shape. Flip the design over and do exactly the same on the other side. And I'm going to come up underneath and just turn that wire over, get that angle moving, being careful not to mark the gemstone or to put too much pressure onto the exit points of that drill hole. So you need to do the exact same thing on the other side. If you do this by hand and you just bend them over, you don't get this lovely sharp bend. So again, with square wire, you're going to need to decide this is the front or the upper side. Pop that bend in and make sure that you're using the same top surface on the other side. It is quite common an occurrence to see that these wires will twist. You can see reconstituted turquoise has got a little bit of a flake coming away there, but I've managed to not crack the gemstone. However, these were the only drops that I could find to work with today, and I really wanted to show you the design. So again, making sure that that same top surface of the square wire is upwards. I'm going to start that bend, bring that over the top, and then make sure I've made that too soft, so I'm going to re-straighten that and then draw that over the top until such time as I can bring those two together. So you can see that we've got quite a tight bend at the top of those designs. And the next thing that we need to do is straighten up these upper wires. So using the heat of my body, what I'm going to do is just put a little bit of a gentle curve in here without changing that nice sharp shape rather that we've managed to obtain at the exit points of the drill hole. So once you've got those two wires bending up to the centre, what we're going to do is put a little bit more of an angle up at the top. If I pop this down on the board, if you imagine that there is a line coming from the 6 o'clock position to the 12 o'clock position, and that's radiating upwards through the gemstone, our imaginary line, that's where we want our two uprights to sit neatly, as side by side, as close together as you can possibly get them. And then we're just going to take a second to straighten those out. Then a nice smooth through. That's the kind of shape that we're looking to achieve. So I'm going to do the same thing again. I'll just do this one off camera and join you in a moment. So I have them now looking vaguely similar. What you will notice, and I didn't want to do this off camera, what you will notice is that there's some little disparity. I didn't perfectly centralise these. That's absolutely fine. What we need to do, the 3.5 inch length is absolutely what we need. So we just need to trim off the bare minimum at the tops there, and make sure that we've got all 4 of those exactly the same length. Make sure those ends go in your scrap pot so you don't accidentally stand on them. So again, we're going to use the round nose pliers just to put the beginnings of a small coil coming out of the top. Now, once you've worked with this 20 gauge or 0.8mm square, it can become quite firm, which is what we need it to be. So if that doesn't firm up exactly how you want it to during the process, I'll show you how to add some extra strength. So we're going to create those coils in an outward fashion, exactly the same as we did on the outer frame. So making sure that we're going to be coiling them outwards. Just going to start that off with a single coil, bend that all the way around, flip the design over. Because my beads are the same front and back, there's really no front and back at the moment. But what you do need to do is make sure that you're gripping the side, the inside and the outside of the square wire, and you haven't allowed that to twist around. That's something when you're first working with square wire, certainly something that I struggled with. Now what you'll notice is because we are forcing on the square wire, more material on the inside of the coil, less material on the outside of the coil, it has a propensity to do an almost Mobius strip-like bend. So at this stage, we just want to make sure that that looks as flat as possible. And keeping your front face or your upper face on that square wire in the same direction at all times is key. So I'm just going to turn those very top bits over and then repeat on the other segment. So we have got 2 inner segments now that look pretty much the same. What we need to do now is decide whereabouts we want this angle to occur. So what we want to do is add in, I'm just going to do this on one side and then do the second section off camera again. What we need to do is have a look at the angles. When you sit the flat drop, or you may be using a briolette, inside the outer V shape, what you need to do is look at the widest point of that pear drop and imagine that there's a line going from east to west. And that's where we want to add our bends so that those outer sections can nestle back in and around. If I show you the finished piece. So you can see the bend occurs just above the widest point on the pear drop. So that's where we're going to aim for. Bearing in mind that when you do make that bend, it tends to just come down ever so slightly than where you thought it would be, which is why we move just above that central line. So let's pop those earrings back out of the way for now. Grab hold of the outer framework. I'm just going to give these lower segments a little bit of a straighten. Once you set the gemstone inside the framework, it becomes a bit tricky to make any modifications. So we're going to make sure that this is perfectly flat. And what you'll see is I'm only really strengthening and working on the lower section of this outer V frame because I want to put a bend in any second now. That's not quite straight. So let's have another look. Pop that on my hand and I can see whereabouts I need to make the bend. So I'm going to pop in with my pliers and I'm going to push that bend over. Now you can see that that's not a bend like you would create in a round wire. It acts quite differently because you've got much more of a leading face. The inside flat surface is the leading face of your profiled wire. So what you will need to do is hold that very firmly, close it past where you want to close it to, and then bring it back out again. And in that way you'll get a slightly firmer bend. Again, there will be some slight wrinkling on that inside edge because there's more material on the inside bend than there is on the outside. You'll then need to flip that over. You can, of course, measure this with a tape measure like clever people would, but I'm going to use that good old-fashioned by eye method. So if I pop those pliers back in again, you can, of course, drop your bead in to make sure that that's going to fit neatly. That looks about right, so I'm going to start bending that over. And if I think at this stage that's not quite right, I can draw those pliers ever so slightly further down, whoops-a-daisy, and push that over the surface until I get that to look approximately equal. You've got a little bit of liberty to make that fit exactly opposite. Of course, you could use a tape measure. And there we go, that looks pretty reasonable to me. So we don't actually want them crossed over. They will want to come up and around in just a moment, but it's really good to get that shape because it will enable you to see if your chubby pear drop, in this instance, is going to fit inside. I think that's going to look lovely. So what we then need to do, once we've been satisfied by that shape, is just open that out ever so slightly at the top. And all I'm doing is just putting a little bit of warmth into that wire. And I'm making very small movements. I'm not doing anything dramatic at a time. If you make large dramatic movements with wire, it ceases to be your friend. So we're going to make small movements and not try to use the pliers quite so much at this stage. So you've got a lovely sharp diamond shape down at the bottom. And if you think that those are slightly different sizes, then you've got a second just to get that sitting a little bit more evenly. So if I pop that down on the board for a second, what we're going to do is drop the second piece into play. Now what I will need to do is just straighten these upright wires to make sure that they are sitting centrally and travelling in a perfectly upward design. This is all coming together how I would anticipate. Now at this stage, what we're going to do is exactly the same on the other side, and then we're going to bring those coils down just a little. But I'll get this segment into the same stage before we move on. So what I've done is I've just taken a couple of extra minutes to make sure that those two component parts are identical for each earring section. It does just take a few moments, and it's all about small, cautious movements, because for the same gauge of wire, so this is 16 gauge or 1.25mm gauge wire, you've got a lot more copper to work with in square wire than you do with round. So it does take a little bit of extra manipulation just to get that absolutely perfect. You can of course use a ruler to get those measurements exactly the same, but I tend to go by eye and then put one frame on top of the other frame and just make sure that they're pretty close size and shape wise. If you'd like to join me back down at the board, we'll show you where we've got to now. So we've got an inner framework which has got the bead attached to, and an outer framework. With the square wire, we're always working with the same surface up visible to us. It does have a desire to kind of twist, especially as you're putting bends into it. Sometimes the end will kind of go over, and it doesn't always go over a full rotation, 25% of the way or 90 degrees around. Sometimes it just has a little bit of a wrinkle. So we try to avoid that wherever possible. Now the designs that I've got as examples, I have wrapped with a short segment of round wire. So that would be 0.4mm gauge round wire, which is equivalent to 26 gauge, and it's only about 4 inches or so for both parts, but I tend to work with a longer section just to make sure that it's nice and easy. On the back you'll see that there is a diagonal stripe, and that's the only thing that delineates which is the front and the back on this design. You can do 2 smaller sections of wrapping if you prefer. Now the beauty of using a half round wire, which is what we're going to use now, again around about 4 inches, and it will be 0.8mm half round or 20 gauge half round. This is German style wire that I'm using today, and the half round gives you a really lovely finish because you put the rounded side outwards, but the flat side goes against the flat wire that we're using here, or the square surfaces of that wire that we're using today. So there's good reasons for using it, it's just a little bit different to get used to. So you can see that there's enough space between the outside edges of the diamond shape going around the bead, and where it meets up with the inner framework, we've got a good length of space here between the coils just to enable us to wrap 3 or 4 times around those. So I'm just going to work on the one for now, and then I will catch up in a moment with the other. So if I hold that section inside the outer section, you can see that they line up, and that bead is just kind of, it could be slightly forwards, it could be slightly behind, or it could sit perfectly inside. It's up to you. So I have my 4-inch section now of the half round. This again is 20 gauge or 0.8mm. If you find it tricky to see which is the flat side and which is the rounded side looks smooth and sultry. The flat side has a different kind of shine to it. It will shine the same all the way across, whereas the rounded side will have a beam of light up the middle. What I like to do is start with just a little bit of an excess so that I can draw that around the back, flat side to the earring section, rounded side up. And what I'm going to do is just hold the tail of wire underneath, draw that half round wire all the way around. I'm going to push that down a little bit and get a second stripe inside. What I need to be careful to do here is not to allow any crossing over of the inner frame wire. Because it's lighter, it's easier to kind of push out of place. So I'm just going to use my pliers to bring that nice and neatly together, and then diagonally on the rear you've got that diagonal stripe coming up from beneath the large coils to above the large coils. And what I want to do now is again wrap around just the inner framework. Now it's very easy to deform that, so we're going to go quite carefully, one small wrap at a time. What you can do to help you along is every time you perform a wrap, just scooch it down into place and draw that around again. Give that a bit of a squeeze. Now you don't completely flatten it because it is a rounded wire. I'm just going to make sure that's nice and firm. I think I'm going to go for one more wrap over the top, and then we're going to finish off on the back. The beauty of working with a half round rather than a round is that when you make this cut, and I'm going to cut approximately midpoint between those 2 coils at the top, cut that excess away. So we only needed probably just over 3 inches of that 4-inch length, but it's much easier to use and to get those nice finishes if you have an excess that you're happy to waste. So I'm just going to squash that down into position. The beauty of using the half round is that when you press it down, it's much more likely to stay down when you're wrapping around 2 or more wires. When you're wrapping a round wire around 2 or more, it kind of gets a little bit tricky sometimes. So it's a really good idea to use the half round if you have any. However, I will show you a little bit more closely with the round wire in just a second. So I'm going to give that a really hearty squeeze before I take my attention back to the front. And I think I'll do 4 wraps at the top and 3 wraps down at the bottom. Flipping over to the rear of the design again, folding that around and then trimming away just over near to the end. Now that has actually just stabbed me, so be careful when you're trimming your wire. I'm going to squash that down into position. Before I give it a final squeeze, I'm going to make sure that I'm happy with how that looks from all angles. Just going to give that a bit of a squeeze now and hold that cautiously in position. Flipping that over onto the other side, you can see that the bead has dropped down slightly, so I can still pull that up and into position. Now to get that to lock in the correct place, what we're going to do now is finish off these coils at the top. Now always be super cautious working with your square wire. It might be easier to show you if I did it this way around. Very, very small movements just to finish that coil down as far as it will possibly go. You may need to just nibble that in. I've got quite warm hands today, so the wire's a little bit slippy and tricky. Now you'll notice that the coils at the top here have got central apertures, and that is because we're going to hang this segment from another piece of wire in just a moment. So I'm going to replicate that on my second earring now with the half round wire, and then I'll show you what it looks like on my original pair with round wire instead. So I've done the stages to create 2 almost identical pieces that sit on the opposite side of the head. They're going to look pretty good anyway. So just to reiterate, I've gone for 3 bands beneath the largest coils and then 4 bands between the 2 sets of coils on both sides. And there's a little diagonal that sits across the back on both of those. Doesn't really matter which way they go. You could wrap them in opposite directions if you wanted to make them equal and opposite, but as that's the back for me, I'm not overly worried about whether those are the same or symmetrically opposite. So for the next section, we need to make an attachment for these to fit on our ear wires. Now you can use really any offcuts of wire that you've got that won't be too heavy. I'm just going to be working with a couple of 2-inch lengths of 0.8mm or 20 gauge round wire. Now it doesn't really matter what it is as long as it doesn't become too heavy for the ears. So these will need to have a small loop in the centre. Let me just pop those ear segments out of the way for now. So what I'm going to do is find the centre of that 2-inch length of wire and just create a little loop that crosses over. So you can judge where that centre point is by just drawing one side higher than the other if you need to. And it just crosses over like so. So it's a little bit like a wishbone at the moment. Now what I will do, once I'm happy that I've got enough space to play with down at the bottom, and there's plenty of wire here to work with, is I'm going to very, very firmly squash down on that loop shape up at the top. Now I'm never crushing where the 2 wires cross over, only where that loop shape occurs. So I'm using any flat facing pair of pliers just to get a really lovely firm squish to make sure that that doesn't come undone in wear. Now the next section is so easy, you'll wonder why you hadn't done it before. It's a really great way to connect your coils to earrings. What I need to do is make sure that those 2 end sections sit at the right distance to just pass through. Once I'm happy with them passing through, I'm going to grab any flat facing pliers. I'm going to pop those across those 2 leg sections, and I'm going to push those firmly backwards so that it creates almost like an L shape. If I show you that sideways, those 2 little leggy sections are going back at 90 degrees. And what I will do then is put the pointy side through the section at the front which is the loops or coils rather that sit up at the top of the earring. So I'm just posting those two L-shaped leggy bits through, and then I'm going to push up so that those wires create almost like a hook. When I flip that over onto the back, what I'm going to do is just draw them so that the end sections align with the front sections, so they will need to come inwards slightly. And then I'm going to trim away an excess, and I'm just going to draw those two hooks around to meet the front leggy sections. So if I trim away an excess just above where the coils are, that's 1 in the scrap pot and 2 in the scrap pot, like so. So that's the kind of distance. It's not a huge amount of wire that sits up proud. And all I'm going to do is now use my pliers to draw that back to meet that front section of the little wishbone that we created. So very, very carefully, small movements, just drawing that back to the front. Exactly the same on the other side. Slightly more tricky to show you because I'm right-handed. So just push that down until it meets the wire at the front of the wishbone section. And then once they are nice and tightly connected, what I'm going to do is hold that sideways and then press very firmly across the two wires that form that hook. And I'm strengthening that so that it won't come undone and it shouldn't get caught on hair or anything like that. So you've now completed your earring. I'll do exactly the same thing on the other one in just a moment. And then I've got an ear wire to pop into the top. So I'm going to open my ear wire like so, opening it like a jump ring rather than stretching it out, deforming it and weakening it. I'm going to pop the earring in so that it sits forwards and then close that earring finding back up. Give that a squeeze to strengthen. And again, just over the single sections of wire, never where it crosses over or meets anything else. And that's your earring completed. I'll finish the other one off in just a hot second. But just to show you the difference in look between 0.8 or 20 gauge half round wire on this side to 0.4 26 gauge round wire on the other side. The design is otherwise identical, it just gives you some finish choices. If you put them on opposite sides of the head you probably wouldn't notice much difference anyway, but I will definitely make a second pair in just a moment. I hope you've enjoyed the Glamorous Drop Square Wire Earrings. It's a really lovely way to get into using square wire if it's something that you've been avoiding, and it just gives a beautiful finish. It's a little bit Art Deco maybe, a little bit fleur-de-lis. I love the design, it's very, very elegant, and you can use any drop that you like, crystal drops, gemstone drops, resin drops, whatever you fancy. You can even make them without a drop in the centre and add liquid resin and flowers and the such if you wish to. Have yourself a beautiful day, and I look forward to seeing you back here on YouTube again very, very soon. I'm Gem Hawks. It's been my pleasure to be with you today. See you soon.